Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Wednesday morning weekly Tanya Shir, coming to you today from an undisclosed location, but still, of course, a great zchus and great pleasure to be here and study Tanya together with you. Excuse the background noise. We're actually holding at the beginning of Perek Yud Gimel, which, as I mentioned last week, it's in some ways it's kind of like the beginning of a new section. As was mentioned, the first 12 prakim of Tanya are sort of seen as a unit in and of themselves, which is why many who are encouraged to study passages of Tanya off by heart, which, by the way, is something that every chassid should engage in to the best of their ability. Well, we were always in yeshiva, and even before bar mitzvah, were encouraged to study at least the first chapters of Tanya off by heart. Sort of brings to a conclusion the first section, or at least one unit. We'll start today with Hashem Perek Yud Gimel. I actually don't, because I'm coming to you from an undisclosed location, I actually don't have the sefer itself in front of me, so I'm using my iPhone for the Tanya. But if you have the sefer in front of you or the iPhone, you can find it on Chabad.org. Perek Yud Gimel Ubazeh Yuvan. So it's interesting, in studying Chassidus, every mimer or every Chassidic discourse that you'll study will almost always begin with a pasuk, will begin with, sometimes a Mishnah, sometimes a passage in Gemara, a passage in Zohar. It'll always begin with some official text, and then almost always starts with questions, right? Why does the pasuk go from Loshen Yochid, from singular to plural? Why does it speak direct and then indirect? Why does it maybe an extra word, maybe, a deviation from the way the Torah usually writes things, a connotation that's strange, things like that. Sometimes apparent contradictions between psukim, or, different questions. It almost always starts with questions. And then in the typical Chassidus style, we go off to talk about something else, right? So in order to understand why, when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, like it does this year, we don't blow shofar, right? Or when the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, as it does this year, we don't check the Lulav and Esrog. In order to understand this will say typically we have to go on to talk about something else. What do we have to talk about? We have to talk about the purpose of creation, why Hashem created the world, why the neshama comes down into the world, why the neshama suffers so much, and off we go to an issue that seems completely disconnected and sort of really just like grappling with the large questions, if you will, or issues. And sometimes go on for pages and pages and weeks and weeks and months and sometimes even years. And what about the original questions, right? What about those? So most of the time we forget, a question. We demand how much can the mind contain at once? We move on to other things. But when you study it properly, besides, of course, that you have to understand all the lofty ideas, in the end, it has to come back to explain the pasuk, and it has to come back to explain the original Gemara or passage from Zohar or Rambam or Rashi that we started with. You got to be able to put it back into the fine details. So there was a question that the whole Tanya started off with, right? That Alter Rebbe began at the beginning of Perek Aleph of Tanya, which is interesting. If you stop people and ask them, everybody knows how the Alter Rebbe starts Tanya, and everybody knows the questions. But if you ask people, what are the answers to the questions, they don't necessarily know, because off the Alter Rebbe goes with a discussion about tzaddikim and Benonim and Rishonim, etc., etc. The question that the Tanya started off with, one of the questions anyhow, is that the Gemara says that a person should consider themselves, a person should consider themselves a Rasha. The Gemara says so much that the person should consider themselves a Rasha, even if the whole world tells you that you're a tzaddik. Even if kol olam kuloi, right? Even if the whole world in its entirety tells you you're a tzaddik, you still consider yourself a Rasha. So the Alter Rebbe asked at the beginning of Tanya two questions on this. First of all, it seems to contradict an explicit Mishnah. Mishnah says, Alti Rasha b'fnei atzmecha, which means don't consider yourself a Rasha. And the second question is, how is a person supposed to serve Hashem? And the first question is, sort of a technical academic question. The Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, don't consider yourself a Rosh. Okay. The second question is let's call it more of a philosophical question, or more of a personal, more of a gut-wrenching question. The Alter Rebbe really, the challenge that the Alter Rebbe asks at the beginning of Tanya: how is a person supposed to go through life and serve Hashem with simcha, v'tuv leivov, when they're walking around with this belief about themselves? Hayei beinecha karosh. These are the two questions that the Alter Rebbe began the entire Tanya, and by virtue of the entire Chassidus, what Alter Rebbe begins the Tanya with these questions. I guess perhaps just to word or to reword the same questions, maybe slightly differently, but nevertheless the same questions. The Alter Rebbe is inherently about asking what type of, in other words, we're talking about a vow that the neshama is being told to make, that the neshama is being forced to make right before the neshama comes into this world. We're talking about a very critical time. The neshama is being armed with what it needs to serve Hashem in this world, as a Yid is supposed to, as a Chassid is supposed to. So what's the message before you go down to this world? Hayei beinecha karosha, consider yourself a Rosha. There's not just a technical question. The Mishnah says don't consider yourself a Rosha. It's not just a technical question. How am I going to consider myself a Rosha and at the same time still serve Hashem with simcha, right? In other words, you can approach the question from a simple perspective, right? How am I supposed to consider myself a Rosha and still serve Hashem with joy? The answer is, here's a pill, right? Here's a breathing exercise. Here's, this will allow you to still serve Hashem with simcha, despite the fact that you think you think of yourself as Zor. The Alter Rebbe actually articulates this in the beginning of Tanya. It's like, so a person shouldn't care, but that's because there's more to the question. The question really is, what's the inherent value in telling a Yid, consider yourself, Hayei beinecha karosha, consider yourself a Rosha? What will, first of all, it's a contradiction. Second of all, it seems destructive. Thirdly, like, what's the depth? This is Torah. This is a lakus. This is Chassidus. We have to open this up here a little bit. In other words, what are we supposed to take from this? Okay, this is how the whole Tanya started, and from this the Alter Rebbe went off a whole explanation. What is a tzaddik? A tzaddik is she'en lo yetzer hara ki harge b'tainas. Tzaddik has no yetzer hara. Why does the tzaddik have no yetzer hara? Because he killed it. What's v'chlal the yetzer hara? If you have to explain that every Yid is the nefesh elokis and the nefesh habamis, and what is the nefesh elokis, what is the nefesh habamis, and based on that, what is a tzaddik, and what is a Rosha, what is a Benoni? Everything that we've been learning now for quite a while. In beginning of Perek Yud Gimel, the Alter Rebbe wants to go back. Actually, go back to the initial question. Based on this, we're now going to touch. We're now going to go back. When the Gemara says that the neshama is made to swear before it comes into this world, Hayei beinecha karosha, consider yourself karosha. Alter Rebbe says it doesn't say Hayei beinecha rosha, consider yourself a Rosha. Hayei beinecha kirosha. Kirosha, the Alter Rebbe will say, is a Benoni. That's the answer. The answer to the question. Hayei beinecha kirosha is not that a Yid should consider, doesn't mean that a Yid should consider themselves a Rosha. It means a Yid should consider themselves a Benoni. Now, we're not talking about somebody who isn't a Benoni because they're a Rosha, right? We're not telling people to fool themselves. Even though you're a Rosha, consider yourself a Benoni. No. We're talking about somebody who is a Benoni, or maybe even a tzaddik. And we're telling them, even if you have successfully gotten to the point where you are a tzaddik, Hayei beinecha karosha, you should consider yourself, you should see yourself as if you were a Benoni. Okay. Now, how does that help? Well, number one, it removes the contradiction. It's not a contradiction to what it says in Pirkei Avos, V'al tihi Rosha b'fnei atzmacha, because it doesn't say Al tihi kirosha b'fnei atzmacha. It says Al tihi Rosha, which means don't consider yourself a Rosha, consider yourself a Benoni. Again, the Mishnah is not talking about somebody who is a Rosha. If you are a Rosha, you should consider yourself a Rosha. We should always have to know the truth about yourself. What we are talking about is a person who is a Benoni, or even is a tzaddik, and we're telling them, don't consider yourself a Rosha. You're not a Rosha. Consider yourself like a Benoni. So there's no contradiction. That's point one. Okay, Baruch Hashem. Point two, there's also nothing particularly depressing, it would seem, about a person considering themselves a Benoni, bearing in mind that a Benoni, as we've discussed now at great length, is perfect with machshava dibur ma'aseh. So this is not bad at all. Okay, but it doesn't answer the deeper question, which is, what's the whole issue over here? Consider yourself this, consider yourself that. In other words, what if the person is a Rasha, he should know that he's a Rasha. If he's a Benoni, he should know that he's a Benoni. If he's a Tzaddik, he should know that he's a Tzaddik. The Alter Rebbe will say, well, the Maimer Chazal really means that even if you are a Tzaddik, you should consider yourself a Rasha, right? That's how the whole Tanya starts off. We make the Neshama swear, Tehi Tzaddik, be a Tzaddik, Al Tehi Rasha, don't be a Rasha. And even if everybody tells you you're a tzaddik, consider yourself a Benoni, which means even if you are a tzaddik, you should consider yourself a Benoni. So what's the deeper significance here in this whole business of considering yourself a Benoni? Also needs to be understood. Okay. But first, the Alter Rebbe will go back to one of the ideas that we spoke about in Perek Yud Beis with regard to a Benoni, and sort of highlight one nuance or one element to it. Again, the Benoni is one who succeeds, is victorious, b'machshava dibur ma'aseh. Only the nefesh elokis reigns supreme in that part of his little city, his ir ktana, his little city, meaning his conscious self, his body. The nefesh elokis there reigns supreme in machshava dibur ma'aseh, in thought, speech, and action. But underneath, in his intellect and his emotions, over there, the nefesh elokis does not reign supreme, is not alone, unless it's during davening or special times. The nefesh abamis is constantly tempting the person, constantly tempting the Benoni, but the Benoni succeeds in machshava dibur ma'aseh. So based on this, the Alter Rebbe will add another sort of dimension or highlight one more element to the process of the Benoni. And this sheds light on the significance of a person, no matter their spiritual stance, even if they are a tzaddik, always considering themselves a Benoni. I'm going to read a few lines from the inside, in the beginning of Perek Yud Gimel. Through this idea that the Alter Rebbe says that we've explained. Maimer Azal, the saying of the rabbis, is a blessed memory. Beinonim constantly have two judges in their head. Pirish Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara are constantly judging them. Says the Alter Rebbe, the pasuk says, "He, the Rabbeinu Shalom, stands on the right-hand side of an impoverished person to save him from the judges of his soul." Okay, a few more lines. I'll try to explain. Chazal did not say with regard to a Benoni that he has two rulers. It says he has two judges. What does that mean? What's the difference between rulers and judges? In the Benoni's case, the Benoni doesn't have two rulers, because as far as what's implemented practically, he only has one ruler. As far as much thought, speech, and action, the only ruler is the Yetzer Tov. So what's the function of the Yetzer Hara? It's like basically the Yetzer Hara is like a husband. He gives his opinion and it's disregarded. I'm kidding. Ella Yetzer Hara, the Alter Rebbe doesn't say that. Ella Yetzer Hara eina rak al derech mashal k'mo shofet v'dayan omer taita b'mishlit. The analogy here is specific, the Alter Rebbe says. It's like a judge who, in a court case, will say his opinion. He'll give his opinion. And despite the judges stating his opinion, it's possible that his opinion will not be the final psak halacha. Why? Because there's another judge who actually argues with him. And you need reconciliation. You need the third party who will come and reconcile between the two. And the halacha, the practical halacha, will always follow the third opinion, right? Because the third opinion is going to create the majority. Other azay, other azay. So the halacha will follow them with the machriya, the one who reconciles. That's the mashal. Again, the mashal is you have a din Torah with three judges, You have a din Torah with three judges. One says Ruvain is chayav, one says Ruvain is potter, and then the third judge is going to decide what the halacha is. So there is the Benoni, we say Benonim zev v'zeh shoiftan. The Yetzer Hara gives an opinion, the Yetzer Tov gives an opinion, and then there is a machriya, there's a third one that says what's going to be. So the Yetzer Hara gives his opinion. The opinion of the Yetzer Hara comes from the left cavity of the heart, comes from the place of selfishness, comes from the place of instant gratification, comes from the place of from the place of where the Yetzer, where the no good stuff is. And because he's not a tzaddik, so it exists. This temptation, this stuff, it's there. So it goes from the heart straight to the brain, to he wants to think about it. Opinion number one. Immediately, there's another judge that argues. Who's the second judge? The nefesh elokis, which is in the brain, meaning the altruistic part, the voice in us that says, do what's right, despite the fact that it doesn't feel comfortable in the beginning. The voice that says we're not behemoths, we're not selfish, self-serving, materialistic beings. We're yidden. We have higher callings. We can be connected to Hashem. Yeah. And as we learned, the nefesh elokis goes from the brain, it goes to the right place of the heart, right? Where the Yetzer Tov lives, and challenges the voice of the nefesh habamis and says, no, we can control, we don't have to stay stuck in a cycle of selfishness. Okay? Nefesh elokis, this is very important. Nefesh elokis and nefesh habamis have this argument. No, so who wins? Even in the case of the Benoni, there is this argument. Just like in the case of a court case. Again, Chazal said, Benonim zev v'zeh shoiftan. The Benonim have two judges. The nefesh elokis and the nefesh habamis have two shoftim. Whenever you have two shoftim, two judges, two rabbanim who argue, you need a machriya. The third voice, the voice of reason, the voice of reconciliation, the voice that will create the majority. So in the Benoni's case, says the Alter Rebbe, he's stuck. He's stuck. He's got these two forces within him locked in battle. Who's the machriya? Along comes the Eibashter and helps the Yetzer Tov. As our rabbi said, this is said specifically with regard to a Jew's ability or attempts to overpower their own Yetzer Hara. Were it not for the Rabbeinu, for the Eibashter's helping a Yid, the Yid would never be able to overcome his Yetzer Hara. This is the dynamic. So the Eibashter steps in. Nefesh elokis and nefesh habam is like a third judge, right? Like a third judge. Sometimes in Din Torahs, they use a system when when two Jews are in litigation, they're fighting with each other, right? Should never know from such things. But so they use a system called zablo, which in very short means if two sides need halachic litigation, need a Din Torah, each side will choose a rav, will choose a posek, and the two rabbanim together will choose a third. So typically what happens is each side chooses a rav who feels will be, or a shofet, or a posek that they feel will be empathetic to their case. So it often happens, not always, but it often happens that each boyer, means each initial judge, argues the case for the one that chose them. And then it really falls into the hands of the third one, the third Rav, who basically in the end is going to decide which way this is going to go, because he's the impartial one. He's the one who is, he's the voice of reason here, the one from the top that's going to move in and go, okay, this is, despite the clash of motives and visions and perspectives, this is the way it's going to be. So the Alter Rebbe introduces this here now. This is as they would say in Yiddish, this is something to process very deeply. The Alter Rebbe says, actually, in the Benoni's case, in the end, the battle between the nefesh elokis and the nefesh abamis, articulated, that rages within him, articulated by Chazal as Beinonim zeh v'zeh shoifton. In the case of the Benoni, both are judging, both are stating their opinion. The machriya, the one who will determine which way this goes, is actually the Eibishter. Allah kedivrei machriya hu HaKadosh Baruch Hu ha'oizroi la'yetzer toiv. Now, of course, in typical Tanya style, there's going to be some explanation, but not a lot of explanation, because the obvious question is, what do you mean? Hashem steps in and makes the Benoni win the battle. So then what? So then we don't credit the Benoni with the success. It's Hashem. Right? It's not the way it works. A person has b'chira chavshis fakert. We say Hakol b'dei shemayim chutz miyira shemayim. The only thing that Hashem doesn't control is the battle of that goes on in a Jew between his nefesh elokis and his nefesh abamis. So what does it mean? Halacha kedivrei amachriya haku HaKadosh Baruch Hu ha'ozer la'yetzer tov. How does that work? V'ha'ezer. What is this ezer? What is this help that Hashem gives? He ha'ora. This is a ray of light. Shemeir oir havai al nefesh elokis. Where Hashem's light shines upon the nefesh elokis, liyos lo yisrain ushlita al sichlo saksil veyetzahara ki yisrain na'or min ha'choshech kaniska la'el. Two lines of explanation. Two lines of explanation. What is this help that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives the Benoni, that he should be able to overcome his nefesh abamis? The help is a special ray of light, that Hashem's light shines upon the nefesh elokis, and this allows that the nefesh elokis can overpower the nefesh abamis, as like the power that light has over darkness, as was mentioned before. That's it. That's all the explanation that Alter Rebbe provides. I want to make 2 points here. The first point I want to make is I want to go back and then try to come back to this for a second and try to explain what's this meaning, that the idea that light dispels darkness. This is the help that the Eibishter gives the nefesh elokis. The Alter Rebbe wants to say something here. He wants to say like this: we're accustomed to thinking that a tzaddik, of course, is greater than a Benoni. Of course. We're accustomed to thinking it's not, and even, I should say, especially based on what the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that the definition of a tzaddik is he doesn't have a yetzer hara, he doesn't have an inclination to sin, doesn't have a desire, nothing. Of course, that's greater than a Benoni. A Benoni does have the desire. He controls it, but he has the desire. And of course, typically, the tzaddik is greater than a Benoni, but there's something that the Benoni has that the tzaddik doesn't have. And it seems like it comes from the deficiency of the Benoni, and yet the deficiency of the Benoni gives room for this greatness of the Benoni that the tzaddik doesn't have. Here's how I would explain it. It's an expression in Chassidus. It says, it's brought down actually in Hayom Yom and in other places. It says that Balei Esek, business people involved in business, they see hashgacha pratis. They see the hand of Hashem in their lives and their business in a way that's more revealed than people who study Torah all day. This is what it says. Those who actually work in the world, who buy, who sell, who things like that, they get to see Hashem's hand working in the world in a way that those who study Torah don't see, which is, if you think about it, it's a strange thing, right? Those who study Torah, sitting and studying Torah all day, they're openly and explicitly engaging in Hashem's wisdom. And yet somehow the Balei Esek, the business people, they get to see the Hashgacha Pratis, they get to see the way Hashem runs the world in a way that a person who studies Torah doesn't. What does it mean? On a simple level, what does it mean? What it means is that the Balei Esek, the business person, will sort of, the person works all day, right? And they get to experience firsthand how, despite our best efforts, And despite doing, every day showing up and doing our best, how truthfully in the end, how little of the outcome we control. In fact, we control nothing of the outcome at all. In the end, it's like, what's the famous word? The guy said, they said to him, what's the secret to your success? He said it was 90% mazel and 10% talent, 10% seichel. He said, 10% seichel, that's it. He said, that's it. He said, and if I could trade in my 10% seichel for a little more mazel, I would trade it in straight away. He said to Mr. Successful Businessman, come on, you're just being humble, 10% seichel, that's it. He said, first of all, yes, that's it. They said you're not going to give yourself credit for any more seichel. He says, the punchline is, he says, and you have no idea how much this 10% of seichel cost me. In other words, he was being honest. He was like, look, do I have talent? Of course. Do I have seichel? Do I make cheshbonos? Yes, of course. And in the end, that usually ends up costing me more than it ends up helping me. The success. The success comes from the Yad Hashem. So again, those who sit and learn Torah all day, they believe it, they experience it in an esoteric level, but they're not engaged practically in realistically. So they learn about it like some philosophical concept. But Dafka, the Baalei Esek, the business people, they get to actually experience this. They get to experience it and they see it, and many of them will tell you in a moment of honesty, they'll be like, look, Hashem has blessed me with tremendous brachas, with tremendous success. And to tell you the truth, I take no credit for it at all. And, sometimes you think maybe they're exaggerating, maybe they're just being nice, maybe they're being humble. But, and some of them, of course, are, but the truth is, some of them are not. They tell you very honestly. And if you sit and talk to them for a minute, they'll tell you, I wanted to do this and I was going to do that and da. And in the end, the Yad Hashem, Hashem's hand prevails. So, what's the wisdom there? The wisdom there is that the Baalei Esek, the business person, lives in a world, in a reality where they have no choice. They have to admit openly that the success, please God, of what it is that they're doing comes to them from directed by the hand of Hashem. Right? One of the shluchim once wrote to the Rebbe about a particular event that he did that was incredibly successful. Incredibly successful. He wrote to the Rebbe, he said, if the event had not been that successful, let's say 1,000 people came. He said, if it hadn't been that successful, if only 500 people came, my Yetzer Hora would have been able to convince me that the success came from my own efforts. He said, but the event was so successful, it was so amazing. He said, he wrote to the Rebbe, he wrote, even my own Yetzer Hora cannot convince me, cannot think for a moment that this success comes from my own efforts. It's so clearly the Eibishter's brachas and the Rebbe's brachas. He says it's not a struggle for me, right? It's clearly from a higher power. So what I'm trying to say is like this: what happens? A person who sits and learns Torah all day doesn't necessarily experience this. You're sitting and learning Torah and standing Torah. I could be tempted to feel like I understand what I'm learning because I have a mind, I have a brain. This makes sense to me. You don't necessarily see that this is the Yad Hashem. Only once a person finds themselves in a position where they themselves can see and feel that this situation is beyond my control. Something's happening here that is beyond me, that I cannot deal with. That's when the person throws their hands up to the Ribono Shel Olam and says, Ribono Shel Olam, I can't control this. I need you to take over. Right? It could be in a positive sense, like I'm saying, a person who succeeds in business, and a moment of honesty will tell you with all the seichel in the world, they would have never had such success. Could be Rachmana litzlan in a negative sense, right? A person gets to a place which is so difficult and so dark in their own life that they say to themselves, you know something, with all the smartness that I think I have, and with all the support that I think I have, and with all the everything, this is completely beyond me. So what happens now? What happens when we face something which is completely beyond us? Something kicks in where we throw our hands up and we say, Ribono Shel Olam, help me. So this is really there's something phenomenal that the Rebbe is highlighting here about the Benoni. This becomes actually something in the Benoni, a quality that's actually superior to a tzaddik. Because in the tzaddik's case, his victory over his nefesh habamis, his victory over his yetzer hara is a victory that makes sense. It's a victory that makes sense. He has the means, he has the tools, he does the work. He can draw a line, a tzaddik can draw a line from his efforts to his battle, all the way through to his success. It makes sense to him. Does he believe that Hashem controls the world? Of course. But does he experience in a revealed way Hashem's hand in this victory? Not compared to the Benoni, no. The tzaddik looks and says, I fasted. I worked on myself, and I eradicated the nefesh habamis, my nefesh habamis from within myself. And a Benoni says, I fasted, I prayed, I worked, I failed. At least compared to a tzaddik, I for sure failed. The nefesh habamis is still very powerful. So what happens now? Now the Benoni goes, Ribono shel olam, I've reached my end. I've reached my end. This is all I can do. May Hashem protect us. But those who go through difficult times in life relate to this in a very powerful way. Addicts speak of this very often. Recovering addicts speak of this very often. How their life often gets to a place where they can no longer function. It's just they hit a brick wall in one way or in all ways. And amazingly, it is at that point exactly that we're called upon to do something very difficult psychologically and emotionally, and that is to relinquish control, or on a deeper level, to acknowledge that we never had control in the first place and say, okay, Hashem, I'm here, I've done my best, this is what I can do. And we ask Hashem to grab the steering wheel and take over. Says the Alter Rebbe, it's at that point of a person's relinquishing of control that Hashem does step in and does take control. And in the case of the Benoni, there is this HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ha'oimed lemin evyain, who stands on the right side of the spiritually impoverished person, l'hoshia mishoiftei nafshay, to save him, to give him salvation from this internal battle that rages within his soul. And Hashem says, okay, I got you. And in truth, in the end, again, like a balesik, like a businessman who shows up at work every single day and says, I'm doing my best, but clearly the success comes from Hashem. The Benoni experiences the same thing. The Benoni says, I'm doing my best, but the fact that I succeed, even just b'machshava dibur ma'aseh, this is the Yad Hashem, not me. This is something that a Benoni gets to experience that a tzaddik does, says the Alter Rebbe. This is something that we want the tzaddik as much as he can to replicate. Which is why we tell every Jew before you come into this world, Hayei be'inecha karosha. Think of yourself in this sense like a Benoni, meaning a person who, in the end, even internally, this is an amazing twist here. As much as we want to argue that the Alter Rebbe says the only thing we can control is machshava dibur ma'aseh, in the end, the truth is the Alter Rebbe says even that we don't fully control either, because we have a nefesh habamis that rages deep inside and doesn't stop. So how do we get control by machshava dibur ma'aseh? We have to show up. We have to engage in the battle. We have to throw everything we have at this battle. And then we have to acknowledge that we're stuck. We lock horns, nefesh elokis, nefesh habamis. Lock horns. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs to step in at that moment and provide some quality, some ingredient that will save the person from this battle. Okay. Last point for today. I got 3.5 minutes. So what is this? What is this magical siyata dishmaya? What is this magical divine godly assistance that saves us? Because what? Because Hashem isn't taking away a person's bechira. The Alter Rebbe says this siyata dishmaya, this ezer, this assistance from Hashem, is articulated best by this quality that light dispels darkness, which means that somehow, which means that somewhere in this battle of the nefesh elokis and the nefesh of the nefesh habamis that rages within the Benoni as they're locked in this battle, the light of the nefesh elokis, the godly divine light of the nefesh elokis, dispels the darkness of the nefesh habamis. Now here's the point. When we say the light dispels the darkness, there's no battle there. Light and darkness, they never battle each other. They never battle each other. It's just the darkness just dissipates in and of itself. Okay. What it means in practical avodah is like this. What it means in practical avodah is, Alter Rebbe is saying, if you cannot win a battle, if you can't win a battle, Hashem says, then you've done your best, and that's all you're supposed to do right now. If we cannot listen to the nefesh habamis that tells us we've lost, if we can just continue to engage, then the quality of oir, quality of light that remains there will dispel the darkness. I want to give you, again, I know I'm low on time here, but I want to give you, mamash, a very quick 2-minute example, right? Imagine you have a 3-year-old child comes to you one day and says, Mommy, Tati, I got a problem. Just to be very careful. What's the problem? I'm having an argument with my friend in school. 3-year-old kids, very worked up about this. I see. What's the argument? Well, he says, your little child tells you, my friend says that 1 + 1 = 3. And I say 1 + 1 = 2. And I'm bringing him proofs and arguments, and he's bringing me proofs and arguments, and we're battling. We can't convince each other. What do I do? Well, what you do is you'd sort of pinch your 3-year-old child on the cheek and say, I have really good news for you. I have really good news for you. If you're the one who's championing, if you're the one who's campaigning that 1 + 1 = 2, I got really good news for you. You're going to win this fight. But how, says the 3-year-old child? I can't convince him. I can't prove it to him. I've tried everything. I've tried Legos. I've tried blocks. I've tried, I've tried shoes. I've tried everything. I can't convince him. Yeah. I don't know at which point exactly you're going to say something, or, that's going to convince him. But sooner or later, the truth of your argument, the good news in the end is that you're right. At some point, that will penetrate. And the battleground, the battle will be over, or the battleground shifts. And that's in essence what the Alter Rebbe is saying to the Benoni. The Alter Rebbe is saying to the Benoni, what's the siyata dishmaya that the Benoni has that helps him? The Alter Rebbe says, what's the siyata dishmaya? The siyata dishmaya is that he has a neshama, and the neshama is a chelik elokami mal mamash, and the chelik elokami mal mamash channels within itself the oir of elokus, and what? And the elokus, in one word, is the ultimate truth. So if you stick with the truth, you always win. Always. Now, the problem is, it takes a while, sometimes, and you need gut and grit, and you got to stick it through thick and through thin. That, says the Alter Rebbe, really is the challenge of the Benoni. But the outcome, halacha kedivrei hamachriach, hu HaKadosh Baruch Hu ha'ozer la'yetzer tov. You see, if you're ever arguing with somebody, theoretically, right? If you're ever arguing with somebody and the person insists on changing the topic, going to something else, and then something else, and then something else, what they're trying to do, often, not always, but often what they're trying to do is they're trying to deflect. Why? Because somewhere deep down, they know that if they sit with this argument long enough, or at least they're concerned if they sit with the argument long enough, the argument is going to implode. And that, my dear friends, listen to me very carefully. That the Alter Rebbe is arguing here in the end is the koyach of the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara doesn't have any koyach, really. Really, nothing. It's just smoke and mirrors. That's it. So b'ha'ezer hi ha'ora shemeir oirav nefesh lekis, because the nefesh lekis is a lakus. Now initially it throws the nefesh lekis off. It's a lakus. It comes from olam atzilus, and one day it finds itself arguing with a behemoth. Yes, says the Alter Rebbe. For some reason, this is the Ratzon of Hashem. But if you can hold out there long enough and not allow the nefesh habamis to take over, if you can just not allow the nefesh habamis to take over, sooner or later, the emes havaya la'olam, the oyer, light dispels darkness. Sooner or later, the truth always emerges. Sooner or later, the truth always, in relationships, in communities, personally, internationally, in every sense, right? L'havdil in the financial world, there's an expression they like to use in Wall Street called, the market is correcting itself. You've heard that expression? The market is correcting itself. What does that mean? The market is correcting itself. Let's make this. It means that if the value of something has been overinflated, it can last a while, but then it bursts. So this, the Alter Rebbe is saying, this is the solution for the Benoni. The Benoni feels like he gets to a place where he's stuck, locked horns with his own nefesh habamis, can't budge. All right, says the Alter Rebbe, just hold it there. If you can be patient enough, the siyata d'shmaya, the emes havaya la'olam will surface. Rabbi Yoel Khan, Olav Shalom, loved to tell a particular story about how when one of the Frierdiker Rebbe's travels, I believe this particular story took place while he was in Eretz Yisrael. One of the Frierdiker Rebbe's travels, he was staying somewhere, and in the neighborhood there was a Yid who had come to Eretz Yisrael. In this Yid's youth, he had studied in Lubavitch in Ton Chetmimim in the yeshiva that was opened by the Rebbe Rashab, that the Frierdiker Rebbe was the Manal Poel, the Frierdiker Rebbe was the director of. So he studied in Lubavitch, in Ton Chetmimim. But at some point he'd become spiritually challenged, and he had gone off the path. And now here he was in Eretz Yisrael leading a completely secular life, and he knows that the Frierdiker Rebbe's, come to visit. And he's wrestling with himself throughout the duration. He wants to go, he was a chassid, he was a Bachar Tom Chetmimim. He wants to go see the Frierdiker Rebbe. On the other hand, he's completely alienated himself spiritually. And he knows that if he goes, he's going to have to deal with stuff internal stuff. He knows the Frierdiker Rebbe is going to, he knows what it's like. He was there, he knows exactly what it's like. And he knows he's going to have to change his life. It's going to challenge him in very deep ways. And he's trying to run away. He's open with himself about this. He's trying to run away from this part of himself, from this part of his life. Anyways, if I remember correctly, Rabbi Yoel told the story. Rabbi Yoel said he had to go to work every day, and the route that he took to go back and forth to work, he found out, passes by the hotel that the Frierdiker, the place that Frierdiker was staying. See, Badafka would go around and he would Dafka dress in clothing that was inappropriate to show up at the Rebbe. So he would make him even more comfortable. In other words, he didn't trust himself. He didn't trust himself to stay away. So he was like going around and he was just trying to survive this trip. The Frierdiker Rebbe should leave and he shouldn't have to face his own eternal truth. But like all good stories go, the last day, he hears that it's the last day. Frierdiker Rebbe is leaving, and he knows this is his chance, and he can't help himself. And he finds himself sitting or standing, opposite the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the Frierdiker Rebbe looks at him and says to him in Yiddish, he says, "Mit dreitzach harum und harum, und zum Sof kommt man on. Was darf man drehen sich melechatchila?" The Frierdiker Rebbe said, in life, sometimes we go around and around and around and around. And in the end, we go exactly where we're supposed to. So he says to him, so what was the point? What's the point in going around and around? If in the end, we end up where we're supposed to, then it was a play on words, because this guy had been walking around the neighborhood in order to avoid the Frierdiker Rebbe. And in the end, he couldn't help himself. He came. So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, so what did you achieve by walking around and around trying to avoid? In the end, you couldn't. But Rabbi Yoel would repeat it, and he would farbreng, and he would say, what's the Nefesh Habamis? What's the whole Nefesh Habamis? The Nefesh Habamis knows the truth, knows the destiny, right? No. It's just the power of distraction, the power of, of toxicity. Toxicity is just smoke and mirrors and change the topic and shout and yell and scream and hope to create enough distractions. People in life, they feel real deep voids in their soul, in their heart. They're right. In the 60s, the hippies in the 60s were burning the country down. The Rebbe said that the Shomers are crying for Elokus. They're crying for meaning, for something deep. So what do? We shove another pizza down our mouths, right? We shove more clothing, a new car, a new trip, that's the Nefesh Habamis. Distraction. Now, don't get me wrong, it's very powerful. And many of us spend our whole lives running around the block avoiding the truth. Says the Alter Rebbe, in fact, it's so powerful that even the Nefesh Elokis may not, in the case of a Benoni, may not have the ability to stomp it out. No problem, says the Alter Rebbe. You don't got to stomp it out. Fight. Wrestle. Lock horns with your own Nefesh Habamis. And then what? And then hold the frame right there. So how does the battle end? How does it end? Simple. 3 words. Light dispels darkness. That's it. That's how it ends. One day, even a 3-year-old kid grows up and goes, oh my God, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3, it equals 2. Silly. And then the whole thing is over. In fact, it never began in the first place. The wisdom, the depth, the significance of the Benoni living in this world where he feels and understands and knows that he himself is not in control. The Benoni constantly feels like he needs the Siyata D'Shmaya to succeed, that he has the Siyata D'Shmaya to succeed, and that his success is not just a personal success, it's the success of the truth of Elokus.